Hello and welcome to this week's Thoughts on Talks with Reverend Mike McMorrow. That's him. I am Malayna Dawn, your host through these thoughts, depending on how you have your screen configured. To me, you're above me because I squished it. That's weird. So usually we would do these Thoughts on Talks, which have turned out to be my thoughts on his Sunday talks on Mondays. So it's like fresh and hot off the presses. This week has been an interesting week in Southern California and the United States and really the world because of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement really stepping up to protest and make sure voices were heard for the legal response to the police officers who were involved in the murder of George Floyd on video. And it's one of those harsh reality checks for things that often go unseen. To have that captured on video and have there be no question really is the difference now from previous protests in the Black Lives Matter movement. I saw a great newscast on KTLA, Channel 5, where they did a timeline of different shootings or events between the police and an African American. And the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests. I want to add S's to everything or nothing. It's hard to say. And it's over the past several years that every time there's one of these incidents, there is a protest, and yet still nothing has changed or changed enough. So here we are, where that's the feeling in the air, is enough is enough. And today, the news has that those 4 police officers have been charged. Something more along the lines of the justice that we've seen previously. So I feel like there's hope.
Well, and you know, this is also, it's got to be more than just training for law enforcement.
Yeah, it's time for all of us.
Yeah, because they're just they're just a representation of the consciousness that we are all holding together that allows them to do and think and to attract the kind of people who do this kind of thing. So
right.
What struck me in the video was how cold-blooded the guy was. And, his hand is in his pocket and he's just like looking up like, yeah, hey, look what I got under my knee kind of thing. And, but if you talk to folks in the community, Black community, they'll tell you this stuff's been going on for decades, and the difference now is that with iPhones and social media, it's now coming to light.
Yeah.
And and it's about time. So
yeah,
I was speaking to one of our members today about what are strategic things, actual strategic steps that we can take that take advantage of the moment, but goes beyond like just this, rending of garments that people are doing in these protests.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm speaking mostly to the Anglo community.
Right.
That I understand, we're all outraged, we're all fed up. We've been, like, for someone like myself, I've been watching this stuff since the 60s, as a little kid. I remember when Dr. King, as a kid, I remember when Dr. King was shot. I was 12 at the time. So, but which is different than living through it.
Right.
But still, it's there. The imagery is there. The depth of grief, within our own household, which was not the same, I'm sure, as Black households at the time, but still, there was an affinity with
right.
Black folk in our household. My dad, of course, we were in the military. Military is a whole different thing. Right? Not that it didn't have all the stressors that civilian life has.
Okay.
And so you're kind of all thrown in together, and you get along because you don't know any different. And
well, and I think that's
you don't have this narrative going on.
Yeah.
Right? In the one hand, I was kind of protected from that because in both cases, I lived in military housing.
Okay.
So, your neighbors are your neighbors. Mine happened, I had, a Keith Black family on one side and a young Southern white family on the other.
Yeah.
But everybody gets along, right?
It has a lot to do with how you were raised and how you grew up. So, like I've always lived in the San Fernando Valley, which is a very multicultural community. So I always had a mix of kind of a little bit of everything in my classrooms growing up. So there were Black kids and Asian kids and Latinos and, a little bit of everything. So that helped me kind of see that mix was possible. But for people who don't live in that kind of community or who are somehow sheltered from, I don't know, a world that is different races and cultures. Like I can see it more if you're in the rural parts of the country, but these things are happening in cosmopolitan areas. So it isn't just, there's also a class issue as well. So we see the outer appearance of it. And yes, African Americans have been targeted in ways that other groups haven't. But it also is a poverty related issue. It's a class issue. It's a whole systemic thing.
Right. And
so for us who aren't African American, but want to be good allies and help bring this equality that's been so long waiting. I think that's our work now, is to study, to talk to our Black friends and ask what helps. And, you could see how some people they want to help, but they're kind of bumbling about it because they don't really realize like the response to Black Lives Matter. Some people say all lives matter and they'll put hearts, and some of them mean well, probably most of them, but it's one of those microaggressions.
Not everybody's walking around with a target on their back either.
Right. And they don't know that when they say it. Maybe they don't understand the full extent of it. I thought the cartoon that you posted on your Facebook page about the house being on fire, I had just within the same hour posted a quote from one of my friends who happens to be African American, trying to explain, she posted in words on her page, trying to explain what the difference is and why that is hurtful because it's dismissive to say, oh no, all lives matter. So that's one thing that non-African Americans can do, is just
that's a great first step. I think the other thing, this is what Salaam and I were talking about, is, you know, in thinking about these things going forward strategically, to pinpoint steps that can be taken to address the systemic changes that need to be made, recognizing that they're generational. I mean, and that it's going to take a decades-long approach. And so to identify those, and I think Salaam is going to, you know, I said, you know, we can call it the contract with America.
Yeah.
But, you know, like 10 salient points, and then to identify at a local, you know, a local county, state assembly, state senate level, on up to congressional and senate level, those legislators who are willing to take, you know, let's say there's 10 points, find 10 legislators who are willing to take parts of this and then move it forward in the legislative process. And so that's something that if white people really want to help support systemic change, because it's not just about African Americans either, it's also about Latinos and immigrants, and, you know, it's something that needs to be shifted. And also recognizing that for African Americans, there has been an orchestrated effort to keep them subjugated going back 400 years. And then, you know, post-Reconstruction with Jim Crow, and then even economically then, right, keeping them, giving them a second-class status on the down low.
Right, I think the
It's
down low
illegal
part.
to do so.
Yeah.
That's what the education part is, right? So for our kids, you know, to stop it so that our kids aren't hearing it at home, they're not hearing it at school.
But then there are these things called microaggressions, which are subtle ways that society discounts or dismisses all people of color, but
well, each other too. Each other.
Yeah. So,
I mean, we're practicing, we're working this stuff out on each other all the time.
Right, exactly.
Right?
So
it's just they have
examples one of my Facebook friends gave was that when you go to the supermarket and they say, you know, nude pantyhose, nude colored, well, who's nude? Because that won't work for everybody. So but that color was named and has been around probably since the 50s, or before, since, you know, stockings and hosiery decided to make it look like you weren't wearing them. And that's just,
those look really uncomfortable, by the way.
Yeah, they're horrible. Nobody should ever wear them.
So it must have been invented by a man.
I'm sure. Absolutely. But, you know, little things like that where the majority assumes everybody is like them. And so the products that are put out are not put out in a way that recognizes that there are different colors of skin, like makeup. Anything, the advertisements, the media, more stories need to be told so that when we see the stories, we kind of take in the ethics and the morality and the cautionary tales and all of that from the stories we see. So I feel like that's been happening more in mainstream media, like Grey's Anatomy, for example. Over the years, it started with a cast that was mixed, but over the years, they've featured the African-American players a little bit more and more each year in such a subtle way that it's almost not noticeable for those of us who have been invested in the characters from the beginning, and you just love them. So you're just following the journey. And then at some point I realized, oh my gosh, this is really cool. Like, they're the stars of the show, of a primetime ABC drama, and it happened so slowly. So things like that.
Was it Eric LaSalle on ER before that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to see, you know, for any child, it's important to see somebody who looks like them being the hero of a story. I put a video on my Facebook page, which was shared by a Canadian friend who's, I can't call her African American because she's African Canadian. She's Dedry Francois, a musician. And it's a French video. I don't know if it's made by a French Canadian, but it's in the French language with English subtitles. And it's for young Black kids, that if you want to emulate an astronaut, Mae Jemison, if you want to emulate, and they show like all of these successful Black people, and it's very inspiring. And I know it's made for the target audience of young Black people, but everybody should
be inspired and celebrate it.
Yeah.
So I have a little anecdote, speaking of African Canadians. So I asked, because I was curious, I asked a Black man up in Canada who is Canadian citizen, so what do you guys call yourselves up here? African Canadians? And he said, no, you know what, we're all Canadians up here. We don't have to deal with that nonsense up here. So, all right.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So it can be done.
Yeah. Another great story or great explanation of everything was from Trevor Noah, who is the host of The Daily Show on Comedy Central, and he was raised in South Africa. So again, it's more of an international look at movements. He was, you know, raised during the apartheid movement, and an overview of movements. And he was really talking about how there's no right way to protest, that protest in its nature goes against the acceptable grain, and that protest is part of America's history. So one of the speakers I heard on, I think it was NBC Channel 4, where they had faith leaders in a split screen with the protesters on one of the first days. Brandon Stix from Think Watts was saying, protest is learned behavior. Look at the Boston Tea Party. That's what this country was founded on. We're protesting, we're doing what Americans are supposed to do, and being told that it's wrong to do it, or that we should do it differently or better or more quietly, not to disturb people. But the point is to disturb. So,
well, the Boston Tea Party actually is not a very good example, because that was actually against a tax on tea, against, you know, the English government, which at the time was their government.
The government, right.
And
but it is a protest. It's not.
It is a protest, but it's not a protest against the authority killing.
Right. No, it's just a protest against the authority taxing, but it's still a protest against the established authority that we should be following the rules, and decide not to because it's wrong, unfair, unjust.
I don't know what they were bitching about. They didn't have income tax.
Yes.
So, all right, we won't tax your tea. How much money did you make last year? We'll just tax everything else. How's that? Anyway.
Yes, that's one of those sneaky things.
So, yeah, so this Sunday talk, of course, to your point, is that came about against this backdrop where once again, and it's like I said in a speech last summer, I've been having to speak to these kinds of issues now for over half of my ministry.
Wow.
Because, starting with Zimmerman and Trayvon,
Mm-hmm.
and, Ferguson was in there. I mean, there's been so many now, you can't even keep track of it. And I didn't even know about this young gal in Kentucky where the drug agents broke into her house when she was sleeping and shot her.
Well, they were plain clothes. So, of course, if somebody in plain clothes busts open your door in the middle of the night, you're going to think you're being robbed, that there's some bad thing is going to happen. And so her boyfriend, who was just staying over at her place, shot one of them. And they fired back, like 3 guys fired 20 rounds.
Right.
Which is, ridiculous as well. And she was just minding her own business in her own house and died. And it turned out that they were mistaken, that they were following a lead on a suspect that was already in custody.
Yeah.
So it was all completely unnecessary.
And what happened to the young man who shot at the cops? Is he dead as well?
I think he's also dead. I think, they just sprayed the place.
Yeah. So anyway, my point is that, it's just going on and on and on and on. And there'll be more before we're done, but we have to take real action. And like I was saying on Sunday, and that means, we got to not only identify and put into place policies that are helpful, but then we have to fund them and fund them properly. And not, I was thinking about this today. I'd like to know how much money and effort is wasted on just trying to determine whether someone should be eligible or something for something. Right? I mean, from insurance companies on through the system. Part of the system is about deservability,
right?
Rather than recognizing, the humanity.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that you can build those costs into a system, and just know, there's going to be some shirkers in there.
Right.
Right. And so we'll add 3% in for dealing with them. And then when we catch them, we'll send them out to Barstow to break rocks in the hot sun all day. But, have some appropriate punitive thing.
Right.
But,
that is even across the board.
So that we're moving forward, that the instead of this incremental glacial. This is the other thing that I don't blame folks in the Black community about, is that, well, number one, nothing has happened without the protest, which is what you were getting at.
Right.
It just doesn't happen without the protest.
No.
I think what happens is we just kind of lose momentum and we can't keep the heat on. And I'm thinking about the Occupy movement as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's going to require strategic thinking. It's going to require finding and enlisting and insisting on legislators that are going to move things forward, and then to have the energy behind it to sustain it. So, because the other thing, now we have this thing with the pandemic.
Yeah.
And, I'm waiting for that to be the next big wedge, because part of what's been going on the last 50 years is we've had all these bullshit wedges that have kept everybody distracted.
Yeah.
And some of them are not by design. Nobody nobody set out to create the crack epidemic. But, you know, just something as, and maybe this is controversial to you, but to me, that whole flag burning thing that went on for years during the Reagan years, that was just a red herring, man. As long as they're talking about burning flags, they don't have to talk about funding Head Start. Right. Right. Or insisting, you know, finding ways to fund low-income school districts so that they have as much capacity and as much access to learning as the more affluent neighborhoods. Because that, to me, that's where it's going to have to start.
Yeah, right? And really it's a focus on poverty and what puts people and keeps people in poverty. And then, you know, they don't get the education, they don't get it.
Because if we don't know any better, then we don't do any better. Yeah. If we don't know any better, then we settle for less than we think we're entitled to. And if we don't have a sense that we matter and that we are entitled to these things because just because we're here. Right. Now our system isn't set up that way. The system says, no, you have to, you know, you have to earn your way. And I'm not against that per se. I'm not saying that everyone should sit at home and collect a check and, you know, do bong loads all day. But because I think there is a divine urge within people to be productive. Yeah. That is the creative urge, that is the divine that's implanted in all of us. That the trick is to just find out what that, you know, we're studying this Dharma book right now, to find out what that calling is, what that fire is, and then to fuel that, even right. As we still have to train our brains to think logically using, you know, arithmetic and algebra and geometry and calculus as the vehicle to learn how to do that. And,
and for that information and those opportunities to be available to everybody. Right. Because as has been pointed out through the Black Lives Matter movement, it's just another hurdle that has to be leapt to get to, like you put in your talk with the track, to get to this, to being equal with everybody right. else. There are several hurdles that have to be jumped to even get to equal starting point, equal opportunity, and then to keep up. So it's that much harder if you start with poverty.
We should show that image of the.
All right, I'm going to show that image because I got that right here. Let's see. And share screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Well, then you shouldn't have given me the button. Now you have to go into the settings. But while you're doing that, it shows how there's staggered starts around a curved racetrack because the ones further out have to go further unless they're staggered. And so it's measured. So everybody, it looks like some people are ahead, but actually because of math and physics.
Did I do that right?
Let me see. Share screen. No, it's still not letting me do it.
Okay.
I think you have to go into the settings of like the meeting. So that part may not work.
How's that?
Okay, there you go.
See that?
Yeah, okay. That works.
Right, so when you look at this graphic, this fellow back here in lane 1, they have him circled in red. And then this fellow up here. Right, so if you're back in here, you think, wow, these guys, they're all getting a head start. Mm-hmm. But it turns out, as you move further out from the center, that you're actually going further if you all start at the same starting line.
Right.
So this is called a staggered start. They're about 22 feet apart. And, to my point, on Sunday, so because I used to run track in high school and one meet in college till I got smoked and quit. But the lane 3 was the optimal lane, because you can hear the footsteps behind you on the one side, and you have these people out here to catch. And when they start out, this guy way out here, these outside lanes, they all look like they're headed. And then as you get into the turn, you see the guys on the inside, like, where did they get that speed? Well, they're catching up to them.
Right, because of the curve and the circumference.
Right, so you just lean into the curve and So, but at any rate, so if you're in this number 3 position, which is the premier position, and you happen to be white, then you can start up here.
Mm-hmm.
You actually move the starting gate up. And if you happen to be tall, if you're male and tall, that works to your advantage. And if you have an Ivy League education, that works to your advantage. And if your daddy can stuff your pockets full of money, they have an old saying in development that the best way to make $1 million is to start with 4 million. So,
wow.
So that gives you a little head start. And if you're out here, and let's say, technically you're on the same starting line, but you're African American, well now, come back here, and maybe you don't have the education, so you come back here, and then maybe you have an unplanned pregnancy, and now you're responsible for that, and so you're back here. So, but you still look like you're ahead, even though you're here.
Right.
But you're,
you have to go further.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great metaphor for trying to explain why the field is not even.
Right, the disparities.
And then, as we study these things more, now we find that, and it's not anyone's fault per se when you observe that most white families are more affluent than Black families or families of color.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not like someone set out to make it that way. At least the people who are alive today. But if you come from a family, let's say the grandfather, or now maybe a great grandfather, came back from survived World War II, and came home and bought a house with a GI Bill, and and didn't drink and squander it away, the way that is part of a story,
right?
But home ownership, of course, has been the big lifter out of poverty.
Yeah.
And the GI Bill was one of those great success stories. I think I'm saying FHA loans. Okay. No, GI Bill. GI Bill helped guys buy houses and also get educated. And so they got the 1-2.
Well, I don't know if you can see this image. It's from Systemic Racism Explained on YouTube. Oh. And it shows a little cartoon of, the difference in the house that is offered to.
Right. Well, that's the other part.
Yeah. So it's a 4-minute video. You can look it up on YouTube. It's called Systemic Racism Explained. And it's from ACT.TV.
Well, I think what some Anglos do is, they find the outliers because they're out there, right? So they'll see, Clarence Thomas or Barack Obama, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, Maya Angelou, or they'll point to other professional, African-American folks who've made it into the professional classes. say, well, see, with just hard work,
Right.
hard work and determination, you can get there. And, that's not to say that that's not so.
Right.
But
it's not the same level of.
It's such a small percentage of the actual population. And I think the other thing about this, and Dr. King was just starting to touch on this before he was assassinated, the fact of the matter is that working people, regardless of race, have been getting the shaft for a while.
Yeah.
And but they also voted. They also have been voting against their own self-interest. So now we're at this situation where we need to find ways to make, reparations of some kind. And, I'm not smart enough to figure that out, but certainly we can start at making sure we have people of color in boardrooms of major corporations that are running our, public institutions and are, recruited, are coaching our professional teams. Just in the same way that the women's movement has been successful in being seen as leaders. If you look at the Democratic ticket, whether you're conservative or not, you have to be impressed with the fact, what was there, like 10 or 12 women who were on the ticket in the primary? Yeah. I don't remember. There was a lot. And
there was. They didn't go very far as the primary votes were tallied. So there hasn't been maybe enough change. But yes, there has been progress. And you can see it's incremental and slow. And just like in the women's movement, they say, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Ginger had to do everything Fred did, but in high heels and backwards.
Yeah.
So for African Americans, you can add a few other, challenges to that. So it would be high heels and backwards and blindfolded and,
right.
with uneven shoes or something like that.
What are shoes?
Yeah, it's just, it's more. And really I can remember the first time I was told that in all horror movies or movies where there's like danger, the Black person is the first one to get killed. I had not noticed that until a Black friend of mine, we were sitting next to each other in the movie theater watching some I don't even remember what the movie was, but it was like there was some dangerous, crazy animal attacking everybody. I think it was a sea animal of some sort. And he's like, watch, the Black guy's going to be the first to go. And I said, no, I love that character. And he's like, it happens every time. And I said, no, it doesn't. And he said, yeah, watch, it does. And he was right. I was probably 18, 19 at that point when he told me that. And I had been studying media. I was in college taking media courses, and that never came up. And I took, multicultural classes too. And it took a friend of mine to point it out. And that's where I've been turning in these times, is to my Black friends to see what they're posting and what they're sharing. So one of the practitioners in our center, Kitty Hack, her son, Damon, posted a beautiful thing on his Instagram. So if you want to look for Damon Hack, a friend of mine, Dr. Scott Bowman, is a professor of justice in Texas, and he's been posting really great things. So that's where I'm looking at, what my friends who have the experience can say, because I'm outside of the experience, just connected just by my friendships.
Well, for Damon to post that was pretty courageous, because of course, he is circulating in the power circles because of golf.
Right.
Golf being what it is.
Yeah. And I did see one of the comments to Damon after he put this very honest, heartfelt expression out on Instagram about how the things that he's talked about with Tiger Woods, how they've both been pulled over on highways when neither of them were speeding and there was no reason to be pulled over, and put all of these things, and somebody had the gall to post, well, boo-hoo, you're rich, so what are you whining about? And I thought, okay, that person missed the point entirely. And there was no picture, so you couldn't see if that person was, what
Troll.
What background, what kind of troll that was. Right. But that's part of it too, is just being people dismissing these right. honest expressions of what they have to deal with. In it, Damon says something about an experience he had where somebody crossed the street to get away from him.
Right.
Because he's a tall black man. I knew Damon as a kid. We were like singing together and doing choreography when we were 8 years old or something. And I just can't imagine trying to cross the street to get away from him, because if I saw Damon now, I think I'd run and hug him. It would be around his waist now or something because he's so tall, but he's just such a lovable guy. Yeah. So, I can, because I know and love Black people who are my friends and extended family, I have that opportunity to feel the pain that anybody treats them as less than the wonderful people I know that they are, which is
I think
you made also on Sunday.
I think that is the key, is that if you do not currently have, you need to think back about people who you've been close to and loved. I mean, that's been one of the great gifts of growing up in the Air Force. So whenever I've seen any of this stuff, I think of, my, the Knox family, right? So Sergeant Knox was my track coach, and Dwayne and I were good friends, and my football coach was African-American. My neighbor, Keith, was always busting my chops. But, once we got out of high school, we got to be pretty good friends. I think of Robin and Michelle and some of the girls that I grew up with too. I think you have to make that connection that, this could be them, or now, all these years later, this could be their kids or their grandkids.
Yeah.
Try and bring it in as close as you can, or Reverend Nancy's nieces or nephews, or Damon, or Cammie, or, tomorrow, right? Or Brenda. I mean, we have people in our community that.
Which is a blessing too. I mean, I was part of a spiritual community for many years that when we would have Black speakers come, which we did fairly often, musicians and speakers, I would always be a little embarrassed because there were no Black people in the room. Yeah. That they wouldn't see anybody who looked like them out in the audience. And that bothered me. So I felt really a lot more comfortable when I started coming to Granada Hills. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's a little bit of everybody here. I feel more at home because that's how I grew up, in a really mixed area.
Well, and that's, that is a tribute to our leadership and also our community that works at being welcoming.
Yeah.
And so those are the ways that we need to look for and to create, pockets of connection.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, and my mind.
And there is this spiritual principle behind all of it, right? That, even though we may feel helpless, and powerless even, there is that one who has all power.
Yeah.
Right. And that, and I think we can and should be engaged in prayer and in contemplative or meditation, to allow each one of us to find what is ours to do in this situation, recognizing that and stepping away from, how it's going to happen or any of the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
But to be open to being inspired to find ways that, not one more kind of idea.
Right.
And, but, that takes a level of courage, when that means speaking up in our families, and finding, again, adapting strategies to, because it's not going to do any good to get into somebody's face.
Right.
Because then all they hear is the anger.
Yeah.
And this was the genius of Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi, right?
Yeah, the nonviolent protest.
Yes, and so now that doesn't, it takes so much more courage, by the way.
Yeah.
To do that, to be willing to stand and just take the barrage and remain peaceful. And, going back to the 50s and 60s, to the lunch counters and the bus boycotts and all that, they had classes, and they taught each other how to react when you sit down at the lunch counter, and how to maintain your composure and not to bite the hook of reactivity.
Right.
And,
Which you can see in that Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper video in Central Park, where Christian, the African-American man, was very calm and knew what was going on and decided to record that. Whereas Amy Cooper, the entitled white woman who weaponized privilege, did it for very little reason, just because somebody said, please don't do what you're doing.
Leash your dog.
Yeah, leash your dog. There are signs. It's not like it's an extraordinary thing to ask of somebody. And she took it.
What's her name again?
Her name, I think, is Amy Cooper.
Sorry?
And he's Christian Cooper, and she is Amy Cooper, I believe. And Trevor Noah speaks about this, that because that also was captured on video, it wasn't just the recording of her calling 911 to say her life was being threatened, but it was this video showing her acting and ignoring her dog and almost choking the poor thing in the process. And the man being accused standing there very calmly, doing absolutely nothing to threaten her.
Well, he was like bird watching or something.
He was bird watching. And his point was, if your dog is loose in this area, it's going to scare away or threaten the birds. It'll disrupt this ecosystem. There is a good reason. And that by itself was enough for me. And then people got curious about who these people were. And Christian Cooper he was a Harvard graduate. He was head of the Harvard Ornithological Society. So he's like not just a casual bird watcher, he's really serious. He also was I think an animator or an artist for Marvel, and created one of the first LGBTQ characters in a comic series. But we shouldn't have to say, oh, wow, this guy is 7 times of wonderful.
Right.
And that's why it's an outrage. No, it's an outrage because she didn't even, it was nothing for her. It was so subconscious for her to know the power she had, to use it, and not even, she knew that he would really get in trouble in a big way, that she was really threatening him with something.
Well, and it was a strategy. It was a very cynical strategy.
Yeah. And manipulative and horrible for the smallest. It's such an entitlement perspective that she came from. But really, she was threatening his life, whether she realized it or not.
Right.
Because Black people get killed from confrontations with police, which ought to be completely peaceful. And if they weren't Black, probably would have been completely peaceful. And that's the point of this whole thing. And
that is the challenge for religious science too, so we don't really have an answer for social justice within our movement per se. Although obviously we've been speaking to it now for a couple of years.
Yeah.
But we're speaking to it, my only thing about that is that we're speaking to it in the safest place, which is within our own echo chamber.
Yeah.
And so even on Monday, so there's a demonstration, a couple of blocks down from the center. And I had good reason not to go down there, just based on, because I went down to investigate, because I was considering promoting it to the congregation. But the person who was down there was so angry and insisting that the police needed to apologize to her for the death of George Floyd. And yet she was, the gathering was not permitted.
Right.
In a formal sense. The police were just there to be seen. And just, in case there were any bad actors, just to know, hey, we're here. And they came in force at the end.
Okay.
Like maybe 20 squad cars with maybe 4 guys in each car. So
I remember on Monday when I checked with you about our normally scheduled time to do Thoughts on Top, you said that there was stuff brewing and that you needed to put your attention there. And so I looked on Twitter, I Googled for Granada Hills Black Lives Matter protest, and I saw that it had been started by just a young woman in the area who wanted to do it, and she said that it had been canceled because there was so much concern for the businesses in the area. And I thought, wow, I don't know that you can cancel something like that if it's not organized by a central group. And it's like a rumor. Once it's out, it's out.
Right.
So,
well, I didn't make it down there for the 3 p.m. kickoff, but I understand there were a couple hundred people there, and that it was peaceful. It was a successful demonstration. And,
I did see something on the news too, where
and the police were supportive of it. By the way, LAPD was supportive of it and found ways to.
Is that our Devonshire division?
Yeah.
The police.
Yeah. Who've been notorious in the past.
Really?
Yes. So even before Rodney King.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So they've, LAPD's come a long way. I'm sure people are getting whacked all the time still, but and I'm never happy. I'd never want to be a policeman. When are you ever happy to see a policeman unless you've just been held up or something?
Right. Yeah. If you are someone who needs their rescue or support, then you're happy to see that.
Right. Yeah, he's the most popular guy in town. But for most, if you're driving down the road and your seatbelt is, caught his eye because it's clanging up here because you didn't use it, or you're on your cell phone, then you're like, or you did that right turn onto Nordhoff down by the college over there, because it was like 9:30 at night.
Like you're speaking of many experiences.
And no one was around. So it looks totally safe, and the motor cop is hiding in the shadows.
Yeah, but as we pointed out before, none of those times were you afraid that you were going to die because you were being pulled.
No, in fact, that Pew study, there was a very interesting, there was
Here, you want to put up the slide?
yeah, there were many interesting points made in this Pew study.
Okay, so it's go to pewsocialtrends.org, and it's from April of 2019, April 9th, 2019, Race in America. You got it?
Yeah, is that on?
Yes, I see.
Yeah, yeah. So in this one here, the question was, do you ever think about being white? Do you ever think about being black?
Huh.
So the interesting thing is that white people don't think about being white.
Because it's like a fish swimming in the water. They don't think about
it's just it's not a concern that they have to think about.
Yeah.
Whereas other races think about it,
because they're the other.
Right.
So, but when I was in Sri Lanka, I stood out because my skin was so pale when everybody else had brown skin.
Right.
And so I got a little hint, a little taste of what it felt like for people's heads to turn and look at me, not because I was doing anything,
right,
but because I stood out because
noticed.
The skin color was so different.
Yeah.
And sometimes it was, I could pretend, oh, I'm like a celebrity and turn it to something fun. But sometimes it was really uncomfortable and a little creepy and a little threatening. And so it is a cultural thing as well. And that, but racism and concerns over skin color it's a universal human thing. And when we don't have skin color to bicker about, humans will find something else. I mean, the class issue comes up. It'll be about religion. It'll be about borders. It'll be about something. We're very contentious creatures. But in America, it's largely a black and white.
Right. Well, that's why I made the point of stressing that, when we, the personal responsibility in this is twofold. One is to do the work to understand that we are enough. And that cuts across racial lines, right? But that we are enough just as we are, in spite of what's going on in the outer world, to know that no amount of recognition is going to make us more of who we already are. And some people are blessed with a sense of that self-respect early on.
Yeah, and it comes from who raised them. And
yeah, I think it's, people, we tap them down. I know in our own culture, in the Irish culture, this idea that you do, you stretch beyond your betters, you just kind of hammer down the the one who kind of pops up.
Okay.
And in fact, I was listening to a podcast where that phenomenon they believe kind of came out of the hunter-gatherer, this leveling process, so that if you were the hunter and you brought in the big kill that day, then part of the ritual for the rest of the tribe is to talk about, oh, the meat's really not that good, or
keep you from getting a big head.
Yeah, the animal didn't have to suffer as long as it did. Yeah, but the idea is just to bring him down, because they understood the idea of power tripping, and if we get a big head. So, and all of this was around an observance that of all the primates, and that in the animal kingdom, that humans are the only ones who blush. So we experience both shame and embarrassment. So, and so this scientist is speaking to that. This is an evolved trait.
But I've seen, like, when you scold a dog, you can see them hang their head. I mean, I've seen it in animals. The blush, certainly, it's because we're like naked on our face. We don't have fur. and stuff like that. But
well, the other thing that we have that other primates don't have is we have whites to the eyes. And so they're talking about these ways that we've evolved to communicate non-verbally.
okay,
Um,
interesting.
yeah.
And that's part of this Pew study?
No, that's just me riffing on some podcast.
Was it from like Sapiens, the book Sapiens or something?
Yeah, it's probably in there. This actually came from a podcast with, I like listening to Ezra Klein.
Yeah, I like him too. He's the founder of Vox. Is that what it?
Yeah, he and a couple partners, but yeah, he's the dude reads a lot of books, man.
Yeah.
So
do you have other slides that you maybe didn't make it to touch on? The hungry tiger. Ooh.
The mind is a hungry tiger that can never be satisfied. That which is timeless swims in and out of our hands, bringing us forth into places we wouldn't go. So listening to what we're not yet aware of involves silencing the tiger and keeping our hands open so we can feel when something tireless moves through us.
Timeless.
Yeah.
7,000 ways to listen.
Yeah, that's a pretty amazing book. He's quite a writer.
Yeah.
And then Raymond Charles Barker, who we will be studying in the summer with Dr. Maureen. All creation starts with desire, that God desired self-expression and the cosmos was born. The desires of our heart are the possibilities that can be manifested in our experience. And that's from the book that we'll be, no, we're actually using the book Money is God in Action, but The Power of Decision is a very powerful book itself. And one that really kind of was instrumental in my own development as a religious scientist, because I never realized, you know, when we come to the science of mind and we start looking at the ways that we think and the tendency of our thought, we see that there are a lot of things that we think of that really are not serving us, including to not decide is a decision.
Right.
To not make a choice is
making a choice. To not make a choice.
Right. So some of this stuff is kind of self-evident. Once he says it, you're like, oh, well, yeah, of course. But then when you start looking at it closely and ruthlessly, and this is, you know, my approach to religious science is to be constantly, you know, observing what I'm thinking of and then take responsibility for it. And which was the gist of Sunday.
And it was, what was the title? It was something about hands. In your hands?
These hands, right. So, which I don't think I ever really tied all that into it, but the idea
hands were in the tiger quote a minute ago, so I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, you know, the thing is that I guess at the end of the day, whether we're talking about addressing, you know, George Floyd and the loss of his life and the system behind it, or even identifying the calling within our own life, and you know, making that welcome and having the courage to step into it and call it forth, and to surrender and give everything we have to it in order to bring it forth. We have to be willing to look at the idea that God is working in, through, and as us. And so in this way, it has to be, you know, if we're going to address the problems of George Floyd, it's got to be through our own. No one else is going to do it. We have to be the ones. And I think
these hands, our hands are the hands of spirit.
Right.
Our feet stepping forth Our defeat of spirit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it's also Pride Month. So the LGBTQ community faces a lot of discrimination as well, a lot of otherness. And I saw a series of posts, I think it was on the Instagram, for the, well, it used to be called the Gaysian podcast, but it's now called the Queer Asian Social Club. And it's translations into all different languages, Chinese, Japanese, Tagalog, I don't know, several, of how to speak to your families about why Black Lives Matter in those languages. So it's a great resource for anybody who's from another background and trying to understand from that perspective what's happening through American history and American culture and why this is important, not just for Black people, but for everybody. Right. It's important that Black Lives Matter. We want all of our government officials, all of our law enforcement officials to realize that as we all step into knowing that for ourselves as well. So we celebrate all otherness, really, and see it all as one. That's the work of, working toward oneness and that one heart, one mind, one spirit that we're all expressions of. So that's where.
And it's available, we just, that's at the end of that, at the end of my talk, I have, Matthew asking, it is given, seek, and you'll find it. Knock, it'll be open to you. That rest assured, everyone who asks receives, and everyone who seeks finds, and for the one who knocks, it is open. So who among you would hand a son a stone when it's bread he's asking for? Again, who would hand him a snake when it's a fish he's asking for? Of course, no one would. So if you, worthless as you know you are, know how to give your children good gifts, isn't it much more likely that your Father in the heavens will give good things to those who ask?
That's one of those interesting wordings. If you worthless as you are.
Yeah.
And I guess that isn't necessarily affirmative, but it's not that we are more worthy than others. Maybe is it?
No, but the point he's making is compared to God,
Right.
And my point in bringing that into the conversation is that we are the ones who bring those values to the earth plane.
Yes.
Because, JC is gone. And he left the Holy Spirit, according to the stories. The great comforter, the great counselor. And so, like Teresa of Avila wrote so long ago, so then that means this work is ours to do.
Yes.
So for us to ensure that everyone has enough to eat, that everyone is respected and honored and cared for.
Yeah. And to look for our commonalities rather than focusing on differences.
Correct. So.
Well, I guess that's all we can do for now. And really, as far as this moment and the Black Lives Matter movement, we can just all do our best to be better allies. Right. And to, I've seen book recommendations. I posted one recommendation from a Sri Lankan friend of children's books that help teach children about being fair and, the issues of racism and all of that. And I thought, well, grown-ups could benefit from those children's books too, just like the cartoon you posted that explains mean, we need these cartoons sometimes as grown-ups to simplify things for us,
right.
as much as children do. So, you know, anybody who's still watching, please take time, if you're on Facebook, to check Reverend Mike's Facebook feed and mine, because we've been sharing different ideas. If you're looking for a prayer or a meditation, Reverend Paulette Pipe does a show called Touching the Stillness, and she's a Black woman. She's actually British, a British Black woman. She does a wonderful meditation that you can find on Facebook. On Twitter, you can check Dr. Scott Bowman. On Instagram, Damon Hack, GC, because it's a golf channel where he, you know, presents. Yeah, there's lots of resources that we're both sharing. And check the center's Facebook page and all of the social media as well.
Right. Well, and I'm on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. on YouTube for a healing meditation. So, which is tonight.
So go get a little snack and come back. Yeah. A little nap, maybe.
Get a little nap, maybe. Yes. So I will see some of you later, and
thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Thoughts on top.
Bye now. Off we go.
And you